டாக்டர் சிவா காணொளியில் ஒரு புதிய அணுகுமுறையாக ஆங்கிலத்திலும் உரையாடல் விவாதங்கள் நடத்துவதற்கு முதன்முறையாக பேராசிரியர் டாக்டர் ஆத்ரேயா அவர்களை நாம் ஒரு விருந்தினராக அழைக்கப்பட்டு இதில் அறிமுகப்படுத்துகின்றோம். சார், வெரி happy to see you, sir. Under the caption of meat and thing, I would like to pose you one question. The Third World War may happen, may not happen. So that is a query existing in everybody's mind. So I would like to know what is the cause and the consequence of the ongoing war, Ukraine-Russian war.
First thing is, the idea of a third world war is simply unthinkable, because if there is a third world war, nothing will be left of humanity. End of story, okay. So a third world war is simply not even conceivable, it can't be on the agenda. And nobody else talked about third world war. Biden may have talked about it, but it's important to see the Ukraine-Russia conflict in a certain perspective, historical perspective. For a very long time in history, Ukraine and Russia have shared many cultural identities. Russian is a language that is spoken widely across Ukraine. Ukraine has been part of the larger Tsarist Russia for centuries. But when the October Revolution took place in 1917, under the leadership of Lenin and later Stalin, Soviet Union and the Communist Party of Soviet Union took a conscious decision that we would allow all the constituent republics of the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the freedom to secede. It is not there anywhere in any other part of the world. Remarkable democratic freedom given to all the constituent members to secede if they wish. In fact, even when Gorbachev was in office, even in a referendum very close to in 1991, the majority of the republics did not want to secede. In all the republics, the majority wanted to stay within the USSR. But Gorbachev was by that time fully under the influence of the Western powers. And subsequently, Yeltsin was even more so after he had overthrown Gorbachev and captured power in Russia using the August coup and all that. He was completely in charge. So Yeltsin is a completely pro-American leader. So in that period, post-1991, what had been a democratic principle of freedom to secede was then turned into an instrument to demonize Soviet socialism and to surround Russia with hostile powers. So at that time, the Ukraine seceded. There were good relations to begin with, and of course there were tensions as well. It is a well-known fact that the eastern part of Ukraine consists of largely Russian-speaking, ethnically Russian population. Russian is spoken all across Europe, Ukraine, including in the western parts. So people of Russian origins or people with ties to Russia of various kinds live across all of Ukraine, and they form a very significant part of the population. So this is something that's a fact on the ground. However, as events turned out, Ukraine was gradually pushed by the Western powers into becoming an instrument to put pressure on the Russian nation. Russia as a country was sought to be subordinated first by the eastward expansion of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a hostile armed agreement which historically was created right after the end of World War II in a bid to prevent the growth of socialist forces in other parts of the world, because much of Eastern Europe and USSR were in the socialist camp, but socialist ideas were very popular in Western Europe. We should not forget that in the elections after World War II, in countries like Italy and France, the Communist Party won something like 1/3 of the popular vote. That's how popular they were. Of course, the eastern part of Germany seceded and became German Democratic Republic and became part of the socialist republics around USSR. So when this collapse of USSR occurred and countries seceded, the West used that opportunity, although in the negotiations with Gorbachev in 1989 over the terms for unification of divided Germany, there was an explicit commitment by the Western negotiators that they would not go east of Elbe River in the expansion of NATO, that NATO would remain a Western European organization, a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not extending all the way to the east. This was the agreement. It is minuted, it is there, and one political scientist has done some recent research, archival research in Britain, to dig out that those negotiations. However, as the events turned out, with Yeltsin completely subordinate to the US, so also Putin to begin with, the West could do whatever it wanted. And so it gradually expanded NATO to many of the East European countries. So today, for example, all the former East European socialist countries, Hungary, Czech, Slovakia, Poland, Romania, Moldova, and so on, all these countries are now part of they all have NATO, they are all NATO members. And in the late 1990s, the US led NATO forces carried out massive bombing of Yugoslavia and Serbia. And Yugoslavia was a multinational state. One of the founders of the non-aligned movement, Joseph Broz Tito, you will remember, along with Gamal Abdel Nasser and Jawaharlal Nehru, the three architects of non-alignment in the 1950s. This Tito's Yugoslavia was just smashed into pieces, balkanized, as they would say in Europe, into several small independent states. And Serbia, which refused to accept Nazi tutelage, was bombarded. 78 days of continuous bombing on Belgrade is what the Western powers carried out without any sanction from any multilateral agency, no UN, nothing. It's completely, it's like they took on Iraq and like they attacked Iran, like they attacked Afghanistan, they completely unilateral actions by the Western forces. So gradually then they used that to expand into Eastern Europe, and they have now surrounded Russia with NATO members. What remained was Ukraine and Georgia. So by 2008, when the Western countries tried to bring Ukraine as well as Georgia into NATO, at that point Vladimir Putin said no further. We will not allow Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. And so Georgia was, there was a war that Russia was able to ensure. Ukraine could not become a member of NATO because immediately there was a conflict. There is a NATO clause that says if there is a conflict in a region, you can't make that country a member of NATO. So gradually, after this conflict subsided, developments in Ukraine kept going in favor of the US, because the US was using a lot of actions of various kinds, arming Ukraine rulers and so on. This is the period of what are called color revolutions, orange revolution, this, that, and so on, where US kept installing pro-US regimes in Eastern Europe. So Ukraine also had a so-called color revolution. But in 2014, the president of the Ukraine wanted closer relations with Russia. Viktor Yanukovych, I think his name was. Immediately, the Ukrainian right wing, which includes a lot of neo-Nazi forces, they immediately launched a big rebellion backed by the US and NATO, and drove out the duly elected president and installed their puppet in the Ukrainian presidency. Subsequently, they had other elections, and this man, the present man, comedian, won the next election and all that, but he remains loyal to the American regime and to NATO. And also he protects all the Nazi brigades and makes them part of the Ukrainian army. So the Ukrainian armed forces are now today significantly corrupted by the presence of Nazi forces. And US has no problem in using Nazi forces to attack USSR, to attack Russia today. Just as they were trying to use Hitler to attack USSR in those days, they are still in the same path. So this was the series of events. So in 2014 when this happened, Russia did not stay quiet. They intervened for two reasons. One, when this new regime was installed in Kiev, the eastern region of Ukraine, that is Donbass region, it's called Donetsk and Lugansk, two areas which have declared themselves independent republics recently. This is about heavily Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic origin people. So they said we will secede from the Ukrainian country, and we will have our own autonomous region. That's how it started. The Lugansk and Donetsk autonomous regions, part of the so-called Donbass region. This is of course a region with a lot of minerals including coal, an economically valuable region. Russia also said that there was a referendum held in Crimea, which historically had been with the Tsarist Empire for a very long time, and then it's been going back and forth. And the Soviets under Lenin and Stalin generously gave away Crimea also to Ukraine. That was the deal. But now you see the Ukraine, Russia's only warm water port is Sebastopol, which is in Crimea. So in the Crimean referendum, majority of people voted to join Russia. So Russia said they have voted, so we are accepting them as a part of the Russian Federation. Russia is a federation still. So Crimea is a republic accepted into the Russian Federation. So this was the situation after 2014. Now we are in 2022. In the intervening period, there have been negotiations between the West and Russia, where Russia has been pushing for a proper settlement to the problems of the people of Donbass region, the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. And in 2015, in the city of Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus, an agreement was worked out in which Ukraine was a party, government of Ukraine, government of Russia, Germany and France. And they worked out a deal whereby the Russian speaking eastern regions, consisting largely of people of Russian origin, would be given autonomy within the framework of a united Ukraine. That Crimea would continue with Russia, and Ukraine will not seek NATO membership. Broad understanding was there. But suddenly in 2021, when the Russian regime learned from intelligence reports that there was a move afoot to bring Ukraine in as a full-time member of the NATO, they said we can't wait much longer, so they started amassing forces all around Ukraine. And even then they were talking to the Americans. They were saying that we are not gone to war. So the Americans didn't want to talk. They said the Russians are going to invade Ukraine. Kept on saying they're going to invade Ukraine. Of course, ultimately Ukraine was invaded. So they'll say, I told you so. So this is the American tactic of pushing Russia in that direction. Instead of responding to Russia's genuine concerns about its security, given the presence of NATO all around it. So if Ukraine and Georgia became part of NATO, Russia would be completely encircled by NATO. So Russia was not going to allow that. And therefore this happened. And ultimately Russians decided to, under Putin as president of Russia, decided to go into Ukraine for what he calls a specialized military operation. In plain and simple words, aggression, war against Ukraine. Of course, so far they have tried to encircle cities, not attack civilian populations to the extent possible, but there have been attacks on civilians also. There have been this hospital that has been bombed, but now it turns out that the hospital is also the hostage for Nazi forces. So it's not clear why that hospital attack. It's a bit more confusing. Russia should immediately cease fire and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. We cannot sanction a sovereign country being attacked by another country just because you don't like their policies. That's not acceptable. But simultaneously, the genuineness of Russia's concerns over its security environment must be accepted. And so, EU, US and NATO should definitely publicly announce that they will no longer seek Ukraine and Georgia's membership in NATO. Because the claim that after all these are sovereign countries, they are free to decide whether to join NATO or not, is somewhat of a bogus claim, because historically NATO was only meant as a hostile force. So why would any country want to go and join NATO unless it had hostile designs on its neighbor? Peace negotiations among all parties concerned, which include the US and NATO, not just Ukraine, and if necessary maybe other countries like China and India could also be brought into the picture. A reasonable peace, security guarantees for Russia, and complete giving up of the claims of membership in NATO to the Ukraine and to Georgia. And in fact, I would add, although that is not feasible now, ideally there should be a rollback of NATO from Eastern Europe. What business do they have there? Why do you have NATO forces at the border of the Russian Republic? Where do they need for it? So, that's where we are now. But this is a war which, as I said earlier, has three dimensions. There is an economic war in the form of sanctions against Russia. There is a military war on the ground, which is what everybody is talking about. And there is an information war. So, the US and Western powers have huge control over global media. So, they are spreading a lot of disinformation over media. And so, especially all of us in India, we should be very, very careful in coming to conclusions based on the reports we get from the Western sources. But we may also explore greater trade with the Russians on a rupee-ruble basis, just like China and Russia are doing it now. And this may also be a necessary move because the what the American sanctions against Russia tell you is that by throwing Russia out of the SWIFT system, the international money exchange system, the US is showing the power of the dollar and saying that I control the international financial system. So, time to think of a democratic alternative to a US dominated, dollar denominated international financial system. Thank you.